this is a big audience, and I think I anticipate a couple of tough questions. I should say at the outset, I'm talking about quite a political river, and that what I'm saying is really my own personal opinion based on research that I've been carrying out and association with the basin over a period of approximately 20 years. So I don't represent the International Water Management Institute talking about the Nile here, right? Just want to make that clear. So what I'm going to talk about is this notion of the Nile as a difficult river, right? Something complex institutionally, complex geographically and economically. And I'm going to say a little bit about the transition that's taken place probably in the last 20, 25 years, if you like, from one kind of political economy to another. The purpose of doing this is really to contextualize the cooperation and some of the conflicts that you probably read about quite frequently in the media, and to put some of that into perspective, because quite a lot of what's written about the Nile within the basin, but also outside the basin, is based on pretty poor perceptions of what's happening in this complex entity. It partly builds on work that I've carried out with the Stockholm International Water Institute and Dr. Anna Kashkau and others, looking at these changes and understanding them and trying to unpack them. And some of that work we've undertaken for a range of donors, and other bits have been of a more academic nature. So it'll be a bit of a mishmash of a presentation between the more policy relevant research and some of the more academic stuff. So, there's the basin. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's a bit difficult because I can't point to it, but suffice to say, around here you have the Ethiopian highland massif, which rises up to about 3,000 meters, where the bulk of the water in the system is generated. So annually you have this enormous flood pulse that pours down from that massif. About 80% of all the water in the system actually comes from that side of the basin and generates this huge flood. And that's important to know, not just because of the emergence of Egypt and Sudan and other civilizations along that part of the river, but that's what accounts for the major energy in the system. And that's the kind of hydropower energy that countries sharing that part of the basin really want to capture. Further south, down towards Lake Victoria here, what's called the Nile Equatorial Lakes part of the basin, there's only a much smaller part of the flow of the system, but at the same time very important because it flows evenly across the year. You don't have this massive great flood pulse. So hence, most of the important hydropower is up here, but this part of the system is very important for summer irrigation and other kinds of agricultural activities up north. So, some big ideas. Well, firstly, in the last quarter of a century, the population in that basin has basically doubled almost. So, there's huge increase in pressure on the resources, and that has also shifted. So it's not just a doubling in size, but the basin population has shifted towards the southern part of the basin, the upstream part of the basin. So this is, again, a kind of structural shift taking place. Demographics in the basin are really important. And that's also a population that's become more youthful as well. It's very important to consider that in relation to the development challenges in the basin, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. It's also a system that's kind of unlocked itself in a quarter of a century. So from the late 90s, you had a period when big superpower rivalries, end of the Cold War, you had this opening up of the political space in the basin. You lost the Soviet influence, as was then up in Ethiopia. You had an opening of political space, and that was important because that set the ground, if you like, the foundations for the political cooperation that subsequently emerged. So you have this process of opening up of political space. You have the demographic pressures in the basin. You also have, if you look at that graph, bottom left there, you have huge economic disparities. So over time, you'll have Egyptian GNI per capita there, hugely advanced compared to the other basin states. So, you'll have this, what's called economic political hegemony in the basin. And certainly at one point in time, quite recently, Egypt's GDP was the equivalent of all the other basin states. So this kind of imbalance economically also factors or has a bearing on the way cooperation proceeds and the way that countries sharing the basin, the 11 states in the basin, perceive their rights and perceive their ideas of equity and equitable and sustainable development. So the other kind of key thing to note is that the system has not only unlocked politically, but it's also emerged two new states. So in that period of time, you have Eritrea emerging, seceding from Ethiopia, and you also have South Sudan from Sudan. So the number of entities, the political entities, has increased over time too. So that's also added complexity. It's added challenges, but it's also opened some opportunities. So what was the old political economy? So up till about the end of the 1980s, early 90s, you really had a very static kind of basin situation. You had this very strong dyadic relationship between Egypt and Sudan, based largely on an agreement negotiated in 1959. So an agreement, the Nile Waters Agreement, that really structured the relationship in that basin for a long period of time. And this dyad, this relationship between the two countries, formed the basis, the kind of the control function, if you like, in the basin, and really added a dimension of kind of stasis to the development opportunities in the basin. The challenges, therefore, led to an imbalance in economic power, a longer-term influence over basin cooperation processes that helped to prevent some of the upstream developments taking place. So what the end of the Cold War really did was unlock that system to some extent. Because what happened is you had this flip. You had a basic structure of political control which suddenly opened up, and the economic space and the political space enabled the introduction of cooperation processes from the early 1990s onwards. And a set of actors then introducing their capacity and their strength to facilitate this cooperation process. So you had a shift from what was a very conventional set of development partners to a much more dynamic system. And some of those drivers of change, if you like, explaining that shift from a more static, controlled situation in the basin to a more open, dynamic system include the pressures, the population, the food security pressures. The spike there you see in 2008 there, the food price spike, also generated some of the challenges the basin states felt in terms of generating food security from the resources and using the basin resources. You had this shift in population around the end of the 20th century. The population shifted upstream, so increased pressures on land resources. You had a new international geopolitics that also arose partly out of the end of the Cold War, with new actors coming in. So you had the Chinese, you had other actors able to finance and develop infrastructure in the basin, who previously hadn't been part of the political equation in the Nile. All of this enabled partly the emergence of the Nile Basin Initiative and other collective action responses, other attempts to bring the states together, emerging from the 1990s, late 90s onwards. And these were very important in opening up the kind of dialogue and space between countries that enable them to identify the benefits and the costs involved in generating new projects, in generating hydropower projects, irrigation projects. So those drivers of change are critical to understanding the kinds of transitions that have taken place from the earlier political economic to the new political economic situation. And maybe there are sort of 4 areas you can identify in the new political economy. Top left, one of them is regional integration. So one of the pushes, partly donor-led, but also within the countries sharing parts of the basin, has been towards economic integration, particularly trade, customs unions, the emergence of the East African community around Lake Victoria, around the NELSAP countries, has been very important in driving understanding of the benefits of regional integration. And that again has generated a set of cooperative regional assessments and understanding that through this kind of development it's possible to identify co-benefits and then to invest strategically in those benefits. A new set of external actors has emerged, the Chinese there, financing and developing a hydropower project in Uganda, but also involved in a number of other projects, the Merowe Dam in Sudan, and also to some extent dams and development in Ethiopia. You have on the bottom left there a whole set of new internal positions taking place. So those are three countries, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, celebrating a tripartite agreement around the development and the operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So, political cooperation around difficult projects is still possible. And part of this new political economy is the parallelism of having this political cooperation alongside development challenges and enduring instability. So the bottom right-hand side there, you have this major challenge in South Sudan, currently, riven by political conflict, and other parts of the basin too. In Burundi, you have a very serious civil conflict. So, this new political economy is interesting, opening up political space, new developments, new forms of cooperation, but at the same time, enduring instability, new actors coming in to implement projects. And two of those key projects, one of them is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So you will have heard a lot about this project. It's an incredibly important project, one of the largest infrastructure projects in Africa, the largest dam project at the current time, with two major kind of features. One is generating power within that region, within the Eastern Nile particularly, but with potential to generate power for a far wider market if the transmission connections are produced between Sudan and Egypt. A regulator of flows, because that huge flood pulse I mentioned earlier is difficult. At the moment, the High Aswan Dam in Egypt is the only dam capable of storing the whole flood of one season. But this new dam in Ethiopia will also be capable of doing that. So really enabling regulation of that flood in ways that haven't been possible before, which is important for irrigation, is important for reducing damage, reducing hazards. And the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has, in a way, been the major game changer since 2011 in the relationships between countries in the Eastern Nile, potentially producing more than all the current production of hydroelectricity in the Nile Basin at present. So almost doubling the capacity, the hydropower development capacity in the basin, providing energy to neighbors like Sudan, but also further afield. And for Sudan, particularly enabling irrigation development and expansion. But that raises a question. So where will this relationship go, this existing relationship with Egypt? How will it emerge when Sudan decides it's going to irrigate more, it's going to develop more food production? Because right now it's not using its full quota of 18.5 billion cubic meters of water a year. But potentially, with this dam constructed and the capacity to manage those dams in sequence and to produce more irrigable hectarage, it could start producing more food, therefore taking more water out of the system. So that's one example of the new political economy. It's the relationship of Sudan to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the existing agreement with Egypt. And the idea partly that Sudan can become a breadbasket again. This was an idea floated in the 1970s, but it's coming back in. That Sudan can become a breadbasket, producing food on a scale that it previously hasn't been able to, but now could, with the dams producing or enabling irrigation across the year in ways they haven't done before. So there you have, the reduction in agricultural value added in GDP in Sudan, the graph at the top, but you'll just see it starting to pick up again. That's very significant because Sudan is probably the only country in the basin that has the capacity to remove lots of water from the system through large-scale irrigation. So from an Egyptian perspective, this is really, probably more serious than the dam itself, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, because it's a hydropower dam, largely for generating power, not for taking water out for irrigation. So, issues here about what Sudan is doing and how it's managing its water are very critical for what happens downstream. So Sudan, and the way Sudan is positioning itself within the Nile Basin, is one of the sort of second critical parts of this new political economy. Previously very much part of this dyad with Egypt, and now increasingly looking upstream to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and managing these dams effectively to enable food production in particular. So a few thoughts in conclusion. Firstly, climate change is the big unknown here. So one of the challenges is from an Egyptian perspective, what happens to their delta when you combine challenges of flow regimes as more and more dams upstream are constructed with the challenge of sea level rise. So the Egyptian delta is home to about 30 million people. And that is a critical area for producing food in Egypt, but also employing people. And the one thing I wanted to kind of connect up to here is, you know, this population growth in the Nile is so critical in terms of jobs and employment. Connects up, you know, obliquely to some of these bigger issues about migration and economic development that are taking place between Africa and Europe. Because the critical issue here is, how do you generate jobs for that young population? You know, how do you bring into the economic process people who hitherto have been farming on small plots, but increasingly need to be part of a broader constituency of manufacturing and industrial development. So in Egypt, there are major challenges. The delta's under threat. It has real problems of salinization, saltwater intrusion, sea level rise. You know, all these issues are connected up to the flow of the river, but also to the ways in which farming is developed in Egypt and how the country irrigates. So the point being that all these different connections, the upstream need for jobs, the downstream need for environmental protection, the climate uncertainties involved are connected up. That picture there, bottom left, very quickly, is, you know, a photograph of what they call kubet in Ethiopia. Those are these fuel pats that are produced from cow dung and soil, and they're a very important, you know, source of fuel, but they also take the organic and the carbon content out of the soil that otherwise would be left behind. So reducing the capacity of soils to retain moisture, the fertility of soils can go down, again affecting agricultural production, affecting potential jobs in the system. So, you know, the connection there with energy, with carbon capture, with livelihoods, with the security of watersheds is very much intrinsic to the challenges of managing this river. Finally, bottom of that pyramid on the right is the Ugandan population. So that's about 20 million people who are 15 years or younger. So just to emphasize, you know, these water issues and the management of a big or large-scale basin like the Nile are intrinsic to the longer-term development of these huge regions. So about 400 million people inhabit the countries of the Nile Basin. How these problems and these issues are interrelated, how the cooperative development of these basins proceeds, how they're supported and how they can develop jobs out of managing and developing effective use of their water resources is intrinsic to the whole development picture. So all the SDGs are embedded in these challenges. Top left there, you'll see probably the only river on earth where it's so stark, but the top of that part of Africa, at night you'll see the Nile Basin lit up as far south as the border with Sudan. Okay, and then you'll see, you know, it disappears. So the energy that's produced in the basin has an immediate impact on the kinds of jobs and the kind of employment opportunities that people can pick up. The challenge being to marry together basin development, cooperation, economic growth, and particularly employment of the youthful population that's being generated in the basin. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. I've gone over time.